What would you do if you discovered your spouse had made a pact with you, a promise sealed in darkness, that if either of you ever strayed, you would both kill the lover together? Now imagine discovering that Pact wasn't hypothetical. It was activated, and you were about to become its architect. Welcome to Iron River, Michigan. Population: barely 2,000 souls. A place where everyone knows your name, your business, and your secrets. Or so they think. Because in this frozen corner of the Upper Peninsula, behind the warm glow of kitchen windows and the friendly waves across snow-covered driveways, something unspeakable was brewing. A marriage built on blood, a promise written in poison, and a trail of bodies that would shock even the most hardened investigators. Before you scroll away, before you convince yourself this is just another crime story, I need you to understand something. What I'm about to tell you isn't fiction. Every word is real. Every victim had a family. Every choice had consequences that rippled through this small community like cracks in thin ice. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why some promises should never be made, and why some secrets refuse to stay buried. If this story moves you, if it makes you think twice about the people you trust, I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like this don't just entertain, they warn, they protect. They remind us that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a neighbor. Sometimes it looks like a friend. Sometimes it wears a smile and brings cookies to your door. And let me take you back to where this nightmare began. Kelly Marie Cochran grew up in a world that never quite fit her. Born in Indiana, she was the kind of girl who seemed normal on the surface, pretty, articulate, charming when she wanted to be. But those who knew her well, those who looked past the surface, saw something else. A coldness, a calculating nature that emerged in small moments. The way she'd smile when others were hurt. The way she'd manipulate situations to her advantage without seeming to try. I've spent countless hours researching this case, speaking with those who crossed paths with Kelly, and what strikes me most is the duality. She could be warm, generous, loving, and in the next breath, she could be planning something that would make your blood run cold. She married Jason Cochran in a ceremony that seemed unremarkable. Two young people pledging their lives to each other, for better or worse, in sickness and in health. But somewhere in the early years of their marriage, according to statements that would later emerge, they added their own vow, their own private covenant. If either of them cheated, they wouldn't simply divorce. They wouldn't separate and move on with their lives like normal people. No, they would hunt down the lover together. They would eliminate the threat. They would kill. Try to wrap your mind around that for a moment. Two people looking into each other's eyes, promising not just fidelity but murder. Not as a hypothetical, not as a dark joke, as a pact, a blood oath between husband and wife. Was it real from the beginning? Did they both truly mean it? Or was it something that grew over time, fertilized by jealousy and control and whatever darkness lived in the spaces between them? In 2014, the Cochrans moved to Iron River, Michigan. A fresh start, they told people, a chance to build a new life in a quiet community. They settled into a modest home, made friends with neighbors, became fixtures in the small town landscape. Kelly was friendly. Jason was quieter, more reserved. Together they seemed like any other young couple trying to make their way in the world. But Kelly was restless. She always had been. And in Iron River, she met someone who would unknowingly sign his own death warrant simply by falling for her charms. His name was Chris Regan, a 53-year-old veteran who had served his country with honor. A man with a good heart, a generous spirit, and absolutely no idea what he was walking into. Chris worked with Kelly at a local business, and over time, their relationship evolved from co-workers to something more. An affair began. For Chris, it might have felt like a second chance at romance. A connection with a younger woman who seemed interested in him, who made him feel alive. He had no way of knowing that every smile, every touch, every whispered promise was drawing him closer to his grave. Because Kelly told Jason. Whether out of guilt or manipulation or simply because the pact demanded it, she confessed. She told her husband about Chris Regan, and according to the twisted covenant they had made, what happened next was inevitable. Chris Regan had to die. October 2014, Chris vanished. One day he was there, going to work, living his life, perhaps dreaming of a future with Kelly, and the next, he was simply gone. His family reported him missing. His car was found abandoned. Investigators began asking questions, but in a town that size, with limited resources and no obvious signs of foul play, the case went cold. For 2 years, Chris Regan was just another missing person, another name on a list, another family waiting for answers that wouldn't come. Kelly and Jason Cochran continued their lives as if nothing had happened. They smiled at neighbors. They went to work. They kept their secret locked away in the walls of their home, literally, as it would later be discovered. But here's what I've learned about secrets and lies. They have weight. They press down on you. They change you in ways you don't always recognize. And eventually, they find their way to the surface. Not through conscience necessarily, but through circumstances, through cracks in the facade, through the universe's stubborn insistence on balance. What happened in that house in October 2014? What did Chris Regan's final moments look like? And how did two seemingly ordinary people carry the weight of murder while continuing to live among their neighbors? The answers were coming, but first, the story would take a turn that no one, not even Kelly herself, could have predicted. To understand what happened to Chris Regan, you need to understand who he was before Kelly Cochran entered his life. He wasn't a perfect man, none of us are, but he was a good one, a veteran who had given years of his life to military service, a father, a friend to many in the Iron River community, someone who would give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. I think about Chris often as I piece together this story. I think about the life he lived, the people who loved him, the future he might have had. Because when we talk about victims of violent crime, there's a tendency to reduce them to their final moments, to define them by how they died rather than how they lived. Chris Regan deserves better than that. He deserves to be remembered as more than a case file number. Chris met Kelly at work, and from the beginning she turned on the charm. She was younger, attractive, full of energy that seemed magnetic to those around her. Chris was flattered by her attention. Maybe he was lonely. Maybe his marriage had grown stale. Maybe he simply made the all-too-human mistake of following his heart into dangerous territory. The affair began slowly, then accelerated. Secret meetings, whispered conversations. the intoxicating feeling of new connection. For Chris, it felt like something beautiful was unfolding. For Kelly, it was something else entirely. Whether she genuinely cared for him, used him as a weapon against her husband, or simply enjoyed the power she held over another human being, that's something only she knows for certain. What we know is that Jason found out, or Kelly told him. The details of that revelation remain murky, filtered through statements made years later when the truth finally emerged. But the result was clear. The Pact was activated. Chris Regan had become a target. The night Chris disappeared, he was lured to the Cochran home. He likely went willingly, perhaps expecting an intimate evening with Kelly. Perhaps looking forward to time alone with the woman he believed cared for him. He had no idea that Jason was waiting, that the trap had already been set, that he was walking into a situation from which he would never walk out. What happened inside that house was brutal. According to later testimony and evidence, Chris was shot. The violence was quick and final. One moment, a living, breathing human being with decades of memories and hopes and fears. The next, a body. A problem to be solved, evidence to be concealed. And this is where the story takes its first truly disturbing turn. Kelly and Jason didn't simply kill Chris Regan, they dismembered him. They cut his body into pieces, methodically and deliberately, as if they were processing meat, rather than disposing of a human being. Some remains were scattered across multiple states. Others were hidden in ways that would take years to discover. Try to reconcile that image with the smiling couple who waved at neighbors, with the woman who showed up for work the next day as if nothing had happened, with the husband who went about his routine, carrying the weight of what they'd done together. This is what I mean when I say evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks completely ordinary. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, protected by our assumptions about what criminals are supposed to look like. Chris's family searched for him desperately. His relatives filed missing person reports. They posted flyers. They pleaded with anyone who might have information to come forward. And all the while, Kelly Cochran knew exactly where Chris was. She knew because she had helped put him there. For 2 years, the investigation went nowhere. Chris Regan remained missing, presumed either a runaway or the victim of foul play that couldn't be proven. The Cochran family moved away from Iron River, relocating to Indiana. Perhaps they thought distance would ensure their safety. Perhaps they believed they had gotten away with murder. But something was happening between Kelly and Jason. The secret they shared, this terrible bond of blood and violence, was changing them. Their relationship, never healthy to begin with, was deteriorating. The pact that was supposed to keep them together was tearing them apart. Jason knew too much. He was a witness to everything. And as the months passed, as Kelly's behavior became increasingly erratic, a new question emerged. If they could kill together once, what would stop one of them from killing again? I want you to pause here and think about something. Really think about it. When you look at the people in your life, your neighbors, your co-workers, the person you pass in the grocery store, do you ever wonder what secrets they carry? Do you ever consider that the friendly face might conceal something unimaginable? What do you think drives people to commit acts like this, to cross lines that most of us can't even conceptualize crossing? Leave a comment below. Tell me what you think. Because understanding cases like this isn't just about satisfying curiosity. It's about recognizing the warning signs. It's about protecting ourselves and the people we love from those who walk among us wearing masks of normalcy. As Kelly settled into her new life in Indiana, the walls were slowly closing in. Chris Regan's family hadn't stopped searching. Investigators hadn't completely abandoned the case, and somewhere in the universe, the scales were beginning to balance. Justice was coming, but it would arrive in the most unexpected way possible, through an act of violence that Kelly herself would commit. Indiana was supposed to be a fresh start, a return to familiar territory, a chance for Kelly and Jason to leave Iron River and its missing person investigation far behind. But you can't outrun what you've done. You can't relocate away from guilt. The past travels with you, packed in the same boxes as your dishes and photographs, living in the same silences that fill your home. The Cochran marriage was crumbling. Whatever twisted bond had held them together, the pact, the shared secret, the knowledge of what they'd done, was proving insufficient to sustain a relationship. They fought. They separated. They struggled with the weight of what they carried. And Kelly was growing increasingly unstable. Those who knew her during this period describe a woman coming apart at the seams. Mood swings, paranoid behavior, hints dropped in conversations that seemed designed to confuse and unsettle those around her. It was as if the act of killing Chris Regan had unlocked something inside her. A darkness that had always been present, but was now demanding more space, more attention, more expression. Jason, for his part, was struggling with his own demons. He drank. He became withdrawn. Some who spoke with him later suggested he was haunted by what they'd done. That unlike Kelly, who seemed to have compartmentalized the murder with unsettling efficiency, Jason couldn't escape the images, couldn't stop seeing Chris Regan's face. Their relationship became a pressure cooker, two people bound by the worst secret imaginable, each becoming a reminder to the other of the line they'd crossed, each representing a threat to the other's freedom. And then, in February 2016, Jason Cochran died. The official cause, heroin overdose. Jason was found unresponsive, and despite efforts to revive him, he was pronounced dead. For a moment, it seemed like a tragic but unremarkable end to a troubled man. Drug overdoses were becoming increasingly common across the country, another casualty of an epidemic that was claiming thousands of lives. Case closed. Or so it appeared. But something wasn't right. Those close to the investigation began noticing inconsistencies, questions about the circumstances of Jason's death, suspicions that grew rather than faded as time passed. And in Iron River, Michigan, investigators were making progress on a cold case that suddenly felt very warm. In December 2016, acting on new information and tips, police obtained a search warrant for the former Cochran residence in Iron River. What they found would confirm the worst fears of everyone who had loved Chris Regan. Bone fragments, buried in the yard, hidden in the walls, the scattered remains of a man who had been missing for 2 years. Chris Regan had been found, what was left of him, and suddenly, everything changed. Kelly Cochran was arrested and charged with murder. But here's where the story twists in a direction that even the most seasoned investigators didn't anticipate. As Kelly sat in custody, facing questions about Chris Regan, she began to talk. And what she revealed about her husband's death shattered every assumption about the case. Jason Cochran hadn't overdosed accidentally. Kelly had killed him too. She had poisoned him. Deliberately, methodically, she had ground up a lethal dose of drugs and served it to her husband, watching as the man who had helped her commit murder became her second victim. The pact that had bound them together, the promise to kill together if either strayed, had come full circle. Kelly had strayed with Chris. They had killed him together. And then Kelly had decided that Jason himself had become a liability, a loose end that needed to be tied off. I want you to absorb that for a moment. A woman who had helped murder her lover then turned and murdered her accomplice. The man she had married, the man she had made that dark promise with years before. She killed him with the same cold efficiency she had applied to Chris Regan. What does that tell us about Kelly Cochran? What does that reveal about the nature of the evil she carried inside her? Some have suggested she was a psychopath, clinically incapable of empathy or genuine human connection. Others point to a lifetime of trauma and dysfunction that might have shaped her into what she became. Mental health experts who have analyzed the case speak of narcissistic personality disorder, of antisocial tendencies, of a fundamental disconnect between Kelly's understanding of consequences and the reality that others experienced. I don't pretend to have easy answers. What I know is that two men, Chris Regan and Jason Cochran, are dead because of choices Kelly made. Two families will never be the same. A community will forever bear the scars of what happened in their midst. In custody, Kelly wasn't entirely cooperative, but she wasn't entirely silent either. She seemed to enjoy the attention, the drama, the opportunity to control the narrative, even from behind bars. She hinted at other victims, other crimes, other secrets that she might or might not reveal, depending on her mood and her calculations. Was she telling the truth? Were there more bodies out there, more families waiting for closure that might never come? Or was she simply playing games, manipulating investigators the way she had manipulated everyone else in her life? The truth, as always, was more complicated than anyone wanted to admit. As Kelly Cochran's story unfolded in the media, the public struggled to make sense of what they were hearing. Here was a woman who looked like someone you might know, someone you might work with, someone who might live next door, and yet she had participated in murder, dismemberment, and then committed a second murder to cover up the first. The details that emerged during investigation painted a picture of calculated cruelty that defied easy comprehension. Chris Regan had been shot and then dismembered. His body parts had been disposed of across multiple locations. Some remains were burned. Others were scattered. Kelly and Jason had worked together on this grisly task, transforming their home into a crime scene and then cleaning it well enough to avoid detection for 2 years. But the walls remembered, the ground remembered, and eventually what was hidden was found. For Chris Regan's family, the discovery brought both closure and fresh horror. After 2 years of not knowing, they finally had confirmation of what had happened to their loved one. But with that confirmation came details they could never unhear, images they could never unsee. A grief compounded by the brutality of how Chris had been treated even after death. I've spoken with victims' advocates who worked with the Regan family during this period. They describe a family struggling to process not just loss but desecration, not just death but the systematic destruction of someone they loved. There are no words adequate to that kind of pain. And then came the revelation about Jason. Kelly, perhaps calculating that she might gain something by appearing cooperative, or perhaps simply unable to resist the spotlight, admitted to killing her husband. She described grinding up drugs, preparing them, and feeding the lethal dose to Jason. She watched him die. She called for help only when she was certain it was too late. Why did she do it? The reasons she offered shifted depending on when you asked. Sometimes she suggested it was revenge, that Jason had become abusive, that she feared for her safety, that killing him was an act of self-preservation. Other times she implied darker motivations, that Jason knew too much, that he was unstable and might confess at any moment, that eliminating him was simply the logical next step in protecting herself. What seems clear is that for Kelly, other people weren't quite real, in the way they're real to most of us. They were objects to be used, obstacles to be removed, pieces on a game board that she believed she controlled. Chris Regan was useful until he became dangerous. Jason was a partner until he became a liability. Even in custody, Kelly seemed more interested in managing her image than confronting the reality of what she'd done. The prosecution built their case methodically. For the murder of Chris Regan, they assembled evidence that tied Kelly directly to the killing. Witness statements, physical evidence recovered from the property, Kelly's own admissions, carefully documented and presented. For the murder of Jason Cochran, they had her confession, supported by forensic evidence that confirmed the presence of lethal drugs in his system. Kelly's defense team faced an almost impossible task. Their client had confessed to both murders. The evidence was overwhelming. The public was horrified. What argument could possibly mitigate what she had done? They attempted to paint a picture of a woman shaped by abuse, controlled by her husband, driven to extremes by circumstances beyond her control. They suggested that whatever Kelly had done, she had been victimized first. That understanding her psychology meant understanding the forces that had created her. The prosecution countered effectively. Kelly wasn't a helpless victim. She was a calculated killer who had made choices at every step. She had plenty of opportunities to report what happened to Chris Regan, to seek help, to choose differently. Instead, she participated actively in murder and dismemberment. And then she killed again. In courtrooms in both Michigan and Indiana, Kelly Cochran faced justice. For Chris Regan's murder, she was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The maximum penalty, a recognition by the court that what she had done was so egregious, so calculated, so devoid of remorse, that she could never be trusted to walk free again. For Jason Cochran's murder, she received an additional 65 years, a number that was largely symbolic given the life sentence she was already serving, but important nonetheless. Important because it said that Jason's life mattered too, that regardless of what he had done, he didn't deserve to be murdered by his wife. Kelly showed little emotion as the sentences were handed down. Those who watched her in court described a woman who seemed disconnected from the gravity of what was happening, as if the verdict was happening to someone else, as if she still believed on some level that she was the protagonist of a story in which she would ultimately prevail. But she wouldn't prevail, not this time. The system, for all its imperfections, had functioned. Evidence had been gathered. Charges had been filed. Trials had been conducted. And Kelly Cochran would spend the rest of her life in prison, never again able to harm another person. For the families of Chris Regan and Jason Cochran, the verdicts brought a measure of justice. not healing. Justice and healing are different things, but the knowledge that Kelly would face consequences for what she had done, that the system had recognized the value of their loved ones' lives, that society had declared in the clearest possible terms that murder has consequences. Understanding Kelly Cochran requires us to venture into uncomfortable territory, to ask questions that don't have easy answers, to examine the psychology of someone capable of acts that most of us can't even imagine. What makes a person capable of not just killing, but dismembering another human being? What allows someone to serve a lethal dose of poison to their spouse, watch them die, and then carry on as if nothing happened? How does the human mind arrive at a place where other lives have so little value? Forensic psychologists who have examined cases like Kelly's point to several factors that often appear in individuals who commit extreme violence. First, there's the question of empathy, or its absence. Most of us are wired to feel something when others suffer. We wince at violence in movies. We tear up at stories of tragedy. We feel physical discomfort when witnessing pain. For some individuals, this wiring is fundamentally different. They observe suffering without experiencing the corresponding emotional response. Other people's pain doesn't register the way it should. This doesn't mean such individuals are constantly committing crimes. Many people with reduced empathy live entirely ordinary lives, channeling their differences into careers and relationships that don't require deep emotional connection. But when combined with other factors, stress, opportunity, existing antisocial tendencies, the absence of empathy can remove a crucial barrier to violence. Second, there's the role of narcissism. Kelly demonstrated throughout her life a pattern of believing she was special, entitled, above the rules that governed others. She took what she wanted without apparent concern for consequences. She believed she could manipulate situations to her advantage. Even in custody, she seemed to view herself as the protagonist of her story rather than a defendant facing justice. Narcissistic individuals often struggle to understand that other people are fully real in the same way they are. Others exist primarily as objects, sources of validation, obstacles to be overcome, tools to be used. When Chris Regan became inconvenient, eliminating him seemed like a reasonable solution. When Jason became a threat, the same logic applied. Third, we need to consider the relationship between Kelly and Jason itself. Their marriage was defined by toxicity long before Chris Regan entered the picture. The pact they made to kill any lover who came between them wasn't the product of a healthy relationship. It was a symptom of something deeply dysfunctional: control, possession, the belief that they had rights over each other's lives that extended to murder. Some researchers who study domestic violence have noted that extreme cases often involve a progressive escalation. Boundaries erode gradually. Lines are crossed in small ways before they're crossed in large ones. Kelly and Jason may have normalized violence within their relationship long before that violence was directed outward. And then there's the question of intelligence. Kelly was not stupid. She was capable of planning, executing, and concealing serious crimes for extended periods. She understood consequences well enough to try to avoid them. She grasped the legal system well enough to manipulate it when she could. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of her psychology. She wasn't acting from impulse or passion or diminished capacity. She was making calculated choices, weighing options, selecting actions that she believed would benefit her most. The murders weren't crimes of passion, they were project management exercises in which human lives were treated as variables to be optimized. What creates such a person? We know that both genetic factors and environmental influences play roles in the development of personality disorders. We know that early childhood experiences can shape the capacity for empathy and emotional regulation. We know that trauma can rewire the brain in ways that persist for a lifetime. But we also know that millions of people experience trauma, difficult childhoods, and genetic predispositions without becoming killers. The recipe that produces someone like Kelly Cochran remains poorly understood. The variables interact in ways we can't fully map or predict. This uncertainty is frightening because it means we can't always identify who poses a danger. We can't simply point to warning signs and declare someone safe or dangerous. Kelly appeared normal enough to maintain jobs, friendships, and a marriage for years. The people around her had no idea what she was capable of until it was too late. So what can we learn from her case? Perhaps the most important lesson is that evil isn't always obvious. We want monsters to look like monsters. We want clear signals that warn us away from dangerous people. But reality doesn't cooperate with our preferences. Sometimes evil wears a friendly smile. Sometimes it offers help and asks for nothing in return. Sometimes it makes you feel special and wanted and understood. Chris Regan trusted Kelly. He opened himself to her, believed in the connection they shared, saw a future where she played a central role. His trust wasn't naive or foolish, it was human. We are social creatures who need connection. We can't live in permanent suspicion of everyone around us, but we can listen to our instincts. We can notice when something feels wrong, even if we can't articulate why. We can maintain relationships that keep us grounded, friends and family who know us well enough to recognize when we're being drawn into something unhealthy. We can remember that genuine connection is built on honesty and mutual respect, not manipulation and control. Kelly Cochran's story is a warning, but it's also a reminder. Most people are exactly who they appear to be. Most relationships are what they seem. The darkness that Kelly carried is rare, even if its consequences were devastating. The judicial process that held Kelly Cochran accountable unfolded across multiple jurisdictions, involving dozens of dedicated professionals who refused to let 2 murders go unanswered. In Michigan, investigators who had worked the Chris Regan case for years finally saw their efforts validated. The tip that led to the search warrant, the forensic team that processed the scene, the attorneys who built a case capable of surviving courtroom scrutiny. Each played a role in ensuring that Chris's death would not be forgotten. The trial was difficult for everyone involved. Jurors heard testimony that would haunt some of them for years. Graphic details about what happened to Chris's body. Clinical descriptions of the dismemberment process. Evidence that transformed an abstract crime into an undeniable reality. Kelly's demeanor throughout the proceedings struck observers as inappropriate. She seemed more concerned with her appearance than with the proceedings determining her fate. She smiled at moments that called for solemnity. She appeared disconnected from the suffering her actions had caused. When the verdict came, guilty of murder, there was relief in the courtroom. Relief that the system had worked. That 12 ordinary citizens had looked at the evidence and reached the only reasonable conclusion. that Kelly's attempts to evade justice had finally failed. The sentencing hearing allowed Chris Regan's family to speak, to tell the court who Chris had been before Kelly ended his life, to describe the void his death had left in their lives, to ensure that the record reflected not just how Chris died, but how he had lived. Life in prison without parole. The judge's words landed with appropriate weight. Kelly would never again be free, would never again have the opportunity to charm a victim into trusting her, would never again demonstrate that killing came as easily to her as breathing. In Indiana, a separate process addressed Jason Cochran's murder. This case presented its own complexities. Jason had been Kelly's accomplice in the first murder. He had participated in killing and dismembering Chris Regan. Did he deserve sympathy? Was his death justice in some cosmic sense? The prosecution took a clear position. Regardless of what Jason had done, his life had value. Murdering him was still murder. Kelly's decision to poison her husband was a crime that demanded consequences. Again, Kelly was found guilty. Again, a sentence was imposed. 65 years on top of the life sentence she was already serving. A statement that every victim matters. That complicity in one crime doesn't give anyone the right to take your life. For Jason's family, the proceedings were agonizing. They had to contend not only with his death, but with the revelation that he had helped kill Chris Regan. Their grief was complicated by the knowledge that the son and brother they loved had committed terrible acts. They couldn't mourn him simply. They had to mourn him fully, acknowledging both who he had been to them and what he had done. This is one of the less discussed aspects of cases like this. The families of perpetrators suffer too. Not in the same way as the families of victims, but genuinely. They have to reconcile the person they knew with the person revealed by the evidence. They have to face the public's judgment. They have to find ways to continue living when the ground beneath their feet has shifted permanently. Throughout the trials, Kelly continued to hint at other crimes, other victims, secrets she might share if conditions were right. Investigators took these claims seriously, examining cold cases, looking for connections, trying to determine whether Kelly's body count extended beyond the 2 murders they could prove. The investigation into these claims continues to this day. Whether Kelly was telling the truth or simply enjoying the attention remains unclear. What is clear is that she understood how to maintain relevance, how to keep people talking about her, how to remain at the center of a narrative she could no longer control. But control was increasingly an illusion. Kelly was in prison, and she would stay there. Whatever games she played, whatever hints she dropped, she would face each morning behind bars, would eat prison food, would follow prison schedules, would age and eventually die in the custody of the state. For many who followed this case, there's satisfaction in that outcome. Justice, such as it is, was served. The system worked. The guilty were punished. The innocent, at least their memories, were honored. Years have passed since Kelly Cochran was sentenced. The headlines have faded. The public has moved on to other stories, other scandals, other cases that capture attention momentarily before being replaced. But in Iron River, Michigan, and in the Indiana communities where Jason Cochran grew up, the echoes of these crimes continue to reverberate. The Regan family has worked to keep Chris's memory alive, to ensure that he's remembered for who he was, the veteran, the friend, the generous soul rather than for how he died. They've participated in awareness efforts, speaking about their experience in hopes that it might prevent similar tragedies. Their message is simple but powerful. Pay attention to the people your loved ones are involved with. Trust your instincts. Maintain connections that allow family members to reach out when something feels wrong. These aren't guarantees. Chris was a grown man who made his own choices, but they're precautions that can make a difference. The law enforcement professionals who worked this case have also tried to draw lessons from it. The importance of perseverance in cold cases, the value of community tips that might seem insignificant but can break investigations wide open, the need for interjurisdictional cooperation when crimes cross state lines. For 2 years, Chris Regan was missing. For 2 years, his family had no answers. The investigators who kept working the case during that period, who refused to give up, deserve recognition for their dedication. Without them, there's no certainty that Kelly Cochran would ever have been held accountable. Mental health professionals have examined this case as well, looking for insights that might help identify dangerous individuals before they kill. The patterns of manipulation, the absence of genuine remorse, the escalating risk-taking behavior. These are warning signs, but they're subtle enough to be missed by those who aren't trained to recognize them. Prevention is always preferable to prosecution. Stopping violence before it occurs saves lives in ways that justice after the fact never can. Every case study like Kelly Cochran's adds to our understanding of what we're dealing with. Every insight brings us marginally closer to prediction and intervention. But we should be honest about the limits of that understanding. We cannot prevent every tragedy. We cannot identify every dangerous person before they act. We cannot build systems foolproof enough to catch everyone who means harm. What we can do is create communities where people look out for each other, where unusual behavior is noticed and reported, where families maintain connections strong enough to spot warning signs, where law enforcement has the resources and training to investigate effectively. The story of Kelly Cochran is a failure story in many ways. 2 men are dead. 2 families are shattered. A community carries scars that will never fully heal. The systems that might have intervened earlier, mental health treatment, domestic violence resources, simple human attentiveness, didn't function well enough to prevent catastrophe. But it's also, ultimately, a success story. The crimes were solved. The perpetrator was caught. Justice was served. The families of the victims received answers, however painful. Kelly Cochran will spend the rest of her life in prison, never again able to hurt another person. That success didn't happen automatically. It happened because people cared, because investigators worked long hours on a cold case, because prosecutors built solid arguments, because jurors listened carefully and reached just verdicts, because communities supported the families of victims, because human beings decided that Chris Regan and Jason Cochran deserved better than to have their deaths go unanswered. In a world that often feels chaotic and unjust, that's worth remembering. Justice is possible. Accountability is possible. Even in the face of incomprehensible evil, the forces of order and decency can prevail. As I bring this story to a close, I want to return to where we began, to the question that prompted this whole investigation. What would you do if your spouse proposed a pact, a promise sealed in darkness, that crossing a line meant death for whoever came between you? Most of us would recognize that as a warning sign. most of us would see it for what it was. Not romance, but possession. Not love, but control. We would know instinctively that anyone capable of making such a proposition is someone to fear, not to trust. But that knowledge comes easier in hindsight than it does in the moment. When you're in a relationship, when someone you love says something disturbing, the temptation is to excuse it, to assume they didn't really mean it, to tell yourself that the person you've built a life with couldn't possibly be capable of the thing they just described. Chris Regan didn't know about the Pact. He didn't know that by falling for Kelly, he was signing his own death warrant. He was simply a man following his heart into territory that felt exciting and new. He couldn't have predicted what would happen because he didn't have the information that might have saved his life. Jason Cochran did know. He participated. And in the end, he became a victim too. Not of justice, but of the same person he had helped to kill. The irony is sharp enough to cut. The pact that bound them together became the instrument of his destruction. And Kelly? Kelly sits in a prison cell, facing the rest of her life behind bars. She's had time to reflect on what she's done, assuming she's capable of genuine reflection. She's had years to consider the choices that led her to this point. The manipulation, the violence, the cold calculation that left 2 men dead and their families devastated. Does she feel remorse? Those who have interacted with her in custody describe someone who remains narcissistic and manipulative, who still seems to view herself as a misunderstood protagonist rather than a convicted double murderer, who continues to hint at secrets and play games with investigators and journalists who come seeking answers. Perhaps she's incapable of the self-awareness that genuine remorse requires. Perhaps whatever is broken inside her prevents the kind of reflection that might lead to accountability. Perhaps she will go to her grave believing she was justified or victimized or simply unlucky to have been caught. But here's what I want you to take away from this story, if nothing else. The universe balanced its scales. Kelly Cochran thought she could take lives without consequence. She believed her intelligence and charm would protect her. She calculated that she could manipulate her way out of any situation. She was wrong. Chris Regan is gone, but his memory is preserved by those who loved him. His family knows what happened to him. His killer faces justice every single day. Jason Cochran made terrible choices, but even he received a kind of justice. His death was not forgotten or dismissed. His killer was held accountable. And Kaylee Cochran, who thought herself above the rules that govern the rest of us, will never again walk free. Will never again charm an unsuspecting victim. Will never again demonstrate that human lives meant nothing to her. The pact she made with her husband, that twisted covenant sealed in darkness, was supposed to bind them together against the world. Instead, it destroyed everything it touched. The lover, the husband, and finally Kelly's own freedom. There's a lesson in that destruction about the nature of violence and control, about relationships built on possession rather than love, about the impossibility of escaping consequences forever. If you've stayed with me through all 8 chapters of this story, I want to thank you. These are difficult subjects to explore. They require us to look at the worst of human nature without flinching. They ask us to sit with horror and try to find meaning in it. The meaning I find is this: justice is possible. Even when evil seems to have won, even when criminals believe they've gotten away with it, the truth has a way of emerging. The scales have a way of balancing, and those who thought themselves untouchable eventually face the consequences they tried so hard to avoid. Chris Regan deserved better than what Kelly Cochran gave him. He deserved a life, a future, years with family and friends who loved him. He didn't get those things because of choices that weren't his to make, but he got justice. His family got answers, and his killer will never harm another person again. In the end, that's the victory, not a happy ending. There are no happy endings in stories like this, but a just one. A recognition that even in the face of calculated evil, the forces of accountability can prevail. The pact Kelly made was supposed to protect her and her husband from betrayal. Instead, it became their destruction. The poison she used on Jason was simply the final chapter in a story that was always going to end badly. Some promises should never be made. Some lines should never be crossed. And some people eventually learn that no matter how clever they think they are, the universe has a way of collecting its debts. Kelly Cochran is paying hers now, and she will continue to pay for the rest of her life. That's justice. That's the final reckoning. And that's where we leave this story, with the knowledge that even in the darkest circumstances, accountability is possible. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the nature of trust and violence and justice, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that illuminate the human condition. And remember, the world is full of people who are exactly who they seem to be. Most of us will never encounter a Kelly Cochran, but staying aware, maintaining connections, and trusting your instincts when something feels wrong, these are the tools that keep us safe. Until next time, stay safe, stay connected, and remember that justice, even when delayed, often finds its way.